Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 79 of the Hammer Territory podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Tuesday evening, a day before we often do this podcast together, and I'm joined by Scott Coleman. And Scott, we threw out the rundown for a couple of different reasons, one of which is not so good. The other one was a much more positive blowout win on this Tuesday. How are you feeling this evening?
Hey, Brad. In some ways, it's very fitting that on the night the Braves win a baseball game 12-0, which was their largest margin of victory all season long. They also saw one of their top starting pitchers go down with a shoulder injury. Stay hot. And it's just, man, I think we're all holding our breath for Reynaldo Lopez. But for a team that has been so starved for offense lately, the fact they were able to put up 12 runs and win a very breezy game on Tuesday night after a pretty disastrous and frustrating Monday night loss, it has to feel good, and hopefully this is a sign of things to come.
For sure. And you and I talked, we should plug this now at the top of the show. You and I did a podcast on Sunday evening, so about 48 hours ago, as we're talking right now, that's still relevant and worth listening to at this point in time. We are also part of Foul Territory, so check out the entire network of podcasts. Please subscribe to this show if you're a new listener, just finding us now for the stretch run and hopefully what becomes a playoff run of some kind. Go ahead and subscribe on Apple, on Spotify, on YouTube is a good pun to push that out as well. Tell your friends, tell your enemies, family members, etc. We're going to be here all the way through and even into the offseason, whatever that happens to be. But yeah, a lot of stuff going on here. In fact, we're probably still going to do this later on in this show, actually. We were planning on doing kind of a mailbag today, but then we were kind of just pushed into not doing that at the top of the show because of the injury. So let's leave with that. And I'm glad you brought up the win to kind of soften it a little bit because it was a nice blowout victory that was a rocking chair kind of win that's been rare this year for the Braves on this Tuesday. But Reynaldo Lopez goes down after just one inning of work, and that one inning, while small sample size, did not look very good. His velocity was not just a little bit down, a lot down. He actually averaged 3.6 miles an hour less on his fastball, where he usually sits and averages like in the mid 95 range. He never even reached 94 on any fastball in the first inning. It did not look good to anybody. And then as soon as he came out of the game, the Braves, at least within reasonable time, said the official diagnosis is right shoulder tightness. So the elbow was what cost him some time earlier this season, about 3 weeks. That was kind of a scare, ended up not being so bad, but shoulders are tricky. Elbow is kind of the most frequent injury for pitchers, but the shoulder is in some ways the scariest one. The initial reports, as we'll get into in a second, are not bad, but we're recording this late night Tuesday, MRI to come on Wednesday. What went through your head, Scott? That's kind of the place to start. Like, where did your mind go? Was it just another one of those crazy things this season of a team that's been banged up, or were you thinking big picture? Where did you go when we saw him exit the game?
Yeah, I think in the moment I tweeted out, the season from hell continues. And it kind of felt like that, because if there is one thing that this organization has really suffered from in recent years, it's that the starting rotation has seemingly come on hard times with injuries in September. And lo and behold, Reynaldo goes out there. And I mean, honestly, I thought the radar gun was busted or something like that. I think the first pitch of the game was 89 miles an hour. And it was like, uh-oh. I will admit, by the way, I will admit this. I missed the start. I actually had it on DVR. I actually saw Steven's screenshot, our colleague Steven Tolbert's screenshot of the velocity, and I was like, what? And I went back and watched, and he had already come out of the game. I went back and watched, and it didn't look good, and it, by all accounts, it wasn't like a technical issue. Like, he just, anytime you see that kind of velocity drop, look, sometimes guys lose a mile per hour or maybe even 2 in a start, and it's like, all right, that's not great, but it's September, guys are tired, etc. When you're sitting 4 or 5 miles an hour down, and your first pitch, like you said, was sub 90 with a fastball, that is eyebrow raising to say the least. Yeah. And, if you're looking for maybe a glass half full or reason for optimism, after the visit on the mound, Reynaldo did throw a couple of balls, I think 93. He got a 94 mile an hour fastball for strike 3 to get out of the jam in the first inning. And according to friend of the podcast, Justin Toscano of the AJC, he said that after the game, Reynaldo seemed to be in decent spirits. And based on what Brian Snitker said, we at least know on this, we believe that this is not going to be a catastrophic thing. I don't know that. No one knows it at this point. Maybe we'll have some more clarity on Wednesday. But to me, anytime you have a shoulder injury for a pitcher, it is always a concern, to be clear. I guess there was a little bit of relief that it was not the same elbow that was hurting him about a month ago. Anytime you're talking about a shoulder or an elbow injury for a pitcher, of course, there's some concern. But maybe the fact that it's not that same elbow is a little bit of reason for optimism. And we're just going to have to hold our breath on the MRI on that shoulder because we have seen firsthand. I mean, Kyle Wright, Ian Anderson, others have had to deal with shoulder injuries over the past couple of years, and they can be really tricky to come back from if there is something wrong structurally.
I think you just wanted to talk about Kyle Wright on the podcast for old time's sake. That was
Our
my reading
man,
of that quote.
21 game winner, Kyle Wright. The man, I hope Kyle's health cooperates because he had a great story, and maybe it won't be with the Braves, but I am sure that Kyle Wright listens to all of our podcasts. And hey, Kyle, hope you're doing well.
Yeah, the only time that you and I ever talk about pitcher wins is when Kyle Wright comes up because it's a good data point for him.
That's right. When it supports, when it supports my initial argument, you love the win.
That's right. All joking aside, though, I mean, Lopez being upbeat, relatively speaking, is good. The MRI is the big thing, and we will not have that result until tomorrow. So hold your breath until then. That's kind of always our messaging when this stuff is kind of looming in the air. It's can't do anything about it. It is what it is. Snit was kind of non-committal too. He did reference the velocity, but seemed like he was checking out okay, as was the quote from Snicker. So at least it's not a disaster. Like we could have come on here. We waited to record the podcast until they talked after the game, simply because there could have been a initial like this is really bad diagnosis, and that isn't the case. So that's positive, if nothing else. And we'll get into it later in our next discussion about what happened on Monday and Tuesday. But the Braves are set up better than most teams would be for this kind of loss. If he is out for a few weeks, I mean, the timing is brutal because it's September and a few weeks is the season in some respects. But the Braves do have a better 3, 4, 5 than most teams do. Charlie Morton, for all of his shortcomings and his relative, unsexiness at this point in his career, is an overqualified fifth starter in a lot of ways. So they're okay there. But at the same time, Lopez has been awesome this year. We praised him a lot for good reason. That's been a great signing. And you just have to hope that he's okay and ready to go for this stretch run because the margin of error is 0.
Hey, FT fam, it's Alana Rizzo. I can't stop talking about Vuori. Vuori is perfect if you are sick and tired of traditional old workout gear. I wear Vuori in all settings, not just in the gym, because honestly, it's comfier than whatever you're currently wearing. No joke. I'm wearing Vuori daily leggings right now. They're high-waisted with the drawstring and cupped ankles. They look good and they feel great. You're going to love them. Vuori is an investment in your happiness. For our listeners, they are offering 20% off your first purchase. Get yourself some of the most comfortable and versatile clothing on the planet at vuori.com/foul. That's VUORI.com/foul. Not only will you receive 20% off your first purchase, but enjoy free shipping on any U.S. orders over $75 and free returns. Go to vuori.com/foul and discover the versatility of Vuori clothing.
Well, and all of a sudden, I mean, we talked the other night about how seemingly every night that Spencer Schwellenbach makes a start, it's the biggest start of his career. Well, if the Braves are not going to have Reynaldo Lopez down the stretch, and presumably even in the playoffs, should that situation arise, then you're really going to need to lean on Schwellenbach. You're going to need to continue to hope that Charlie Morton continues to pitch really well. And I don't know what they would do, Brad. I mean, they have AJ Smith-Shawver, they have Ian Anderson, they have Bryce Elder, who would be a distant third, I think, for me. But you at least have 3 capable arms at varying degrees, and none of them can come up and be expected to be Reynaldo Lopez. But at least you do have some depth where you're not suddenly having to throw, I don't know, an Alan Winans to make starts, or one of those types of Darius Vines. No hate towards those guys, but they're not ready to make September starts and potentially even October bullpen appearances or whatever the situation might be. So you just have to hope that Ronaldo's fine. And even if he is injured, it is not necessarily a death blow to this team.
It's not, and we will save some of this reaction, and hopefully we won't have to give it. If the news is good and he's able to go, this will be moot. But you're right. And also because it's so late, it's kind of a double-edged sword. If it's an injury that is a couple of weeks, he'll be gone. But also, it's only a couple of starts you have to navigate because once you get in the playoffs, it's four guys you need at the most to start games. Three in that first series. The Braves are going to be in the wild card series if they get there. It's only a 3-game series, etc. I know that no one, including me, even as the Charlie Morton guy, I'm not terribly enthused about a Charlie Morton playoff start. But again, it's a problem that the Braves would have, but not one that is like totally unmanageable. And we'll talk about that. In fact, right now, because Morton was the only good thing about Monday's game, uh, we can choose to pass over the offensive disaster, and it was arguably the worst performance of the season from the offense. I'll ask that question to you in a second, but I'm choosing to be positive right now for a moment, Scott. Morton's been pretty good in recent days, and I know I am predisposed to liking Charlie more than everybody else seems to, but he's now thrown pretty well in 6 straight starts, including a 1-run performance on Monday. How are you feeling, objectively speaking? Don't spare my feelings on the podcast, Scott. Where are you at on the Charlie experience on September 10th?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to give you credit, Brad, because maybe 6 weeks ago I came on the show and said that Father Time had come for Charlie Morton.
You buried him. You buried him on the podcast. It happened.
I did.
I'm kidding. I mean, you did it. And by the way, I think it was somewhat justified, even if I was going to take the other side.
There was a stretch for Charlie that was really bad. And,
Yes.
I think a lot of folks were thinking, okay, is this it? Hell of a career, 40 years old, and, World Series champion multiple times, blah, blah, blah. But Charlie's been awesome. And you pulled the number here, but over Charlie's last 6 starts, which is 34 innings, 43 strikeouts and a 2.88 ERA for Charlie Morton. That's very good, especially the strikeouts is particularly interesting because if Chuck has that strikeout working, I do think there's a world where he could make a potential postseason start should it come to that if he continues to strike batters out. That is, of course, such a weapon to have in a playoff series where not even just runs, but base runners are at a premium. So credit to Charlie. He has really turned it on in the second half of the season. And even as the offense has wavered more times than not, Charlie has given the Braves a chance to win every single time he goes out there. And you mentioned that he is effectively their number 5 starter. I mean, that's really impressive and a luxury that basically no other teams have.
Right. Even putting away my kind of bit about Charlie, I do think that I believe this, and it's backed up by the numbers that you may not argue he's the best 5th starter in the league, but he is certainly on a very short list of, if you compiled every team's number 5 starter, he would probably be number 1 for me and certainly in the top 2 or 3. So it's a good guy to have there. We'll leave it there. Hopefully he won't become this high profile guy. But yeah, I think that it would not be comfortable for anyone if you threw him in a playoff game. But if you did it so with a short leash, you can kind of monitor what he has and what he does. Because I will say about Charlie, there are times when he has it and he looks like old Charlie, and then you can kind of tell when he doesn't have it and he's not missing bats. I will say it's kind of funny. It was not his fault in any way. They lost the game on Monday because they just couldn't score runs. But I thought it was deeply ironic for our podcast that the only runner that scored was hit by Charlie by a pitch.
Yeah.
On brand. On brand to the end.
It is not America's favorite game when it ends up being the game-winning run. Let me ask you, Brad, and I think I know your answer, and I think most people listening would share the same answer, but I am curious. If game 3 of the wild card round was tomorrow, would you start Charlie Morton or would you start Spencer Schwellenbach?
Oh man, it's funny because we got a mailbag question that we kind of were going to throw out about a game 3 starter because we got it before Lopez's injury and it was basically going to be Lopez versus Schwellenbach. I think you have to go to Spencer if he looks like he's looked for the last couple of months, and I say that as the Morton guy. I do think that there is 3 weeks left, and Spencer was not his best in his last start, and maybe he hits a wall. That's definitely possible. Charlie's also 1,000 years old, but provided that they don't know anything that we don't know about Spencer Schwellenbach slowing down or being worried about him, he's been the better pitcher. So I think you go with him. I think you got to have a plan behind him because he'd be a young guy making his first playoff start. You got to be ready for him to not have his best stuff. But even as resident Morton guy, it's still Schwellenbach for me.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's the way I was leaning. I think most folks would feel that way. But hey, we all are very bullish on Schwellenbach. But if his next 3 starts go poorly, and the
Yeah.
Braves still find themselves in the postseason, I mean, it is at least a conversation. And at least, I mean, let's hope that Reynaldo Lopez is fine. Maybe
Yes.
they skip his next start just to be safe, or whatever the prognosis is. But it is a conversation worth having, as there are, I think, 17 baseball games left in the regular season. We
That's
are
it.
we're very closely getting to October.
Yeah, and hopefully October matters for this team, which is for not a lock, unfortunately, for anybody involved. We talked around it. We don't have to dwell on it, but it was really brutal offensively on Monday. They got 2 hits, both were singles by Matt Olson, who's been pretty good lately, and they got 1 walk from Marcell Ozuna. And while Nick Martinez is having a pretty good year, my note was that he's not Zach Wheeler. So it was one of the worst. We don't have to litigate the worst, but one of the worst performances of the season offensively. It was their 10th shutout of the year. We'll come back to this in our mailbag portion of the podcast, but there's been a lot of consternation about the lineup, and we'll tackle that. But I thought it was also deeply, I don't know if funny is the word, that they followed up their maybe worst showing of the season offensively with one of their best, with 12 runs on Tuesday, 12-0. They scored 10 runs in 4 games coming into Tuesday, and then they scored 10 runs in 4 innings on Tuesday.
Yeah. Incredibly on brand for this team, which seemingly nobody can figure out. I mean, I had Monday Night Football on the television, and I had the Braves on the iPad on Monday night, and thank God there was something else to occupy my mind and my thoughts, because, I mean, just talk about a pathetic showing offensively on Monday, especially after you had all of the highs and the emotion of that comeback walk-off win on Sunday afternoon. What do you do? But you follow it up with probably the worst showing of the season, maybe at least bottom 3. And the fact that we probably can't even distinguish what is the worst showing of the last couple of weeks probably says quite a bit about the current state of the lineup.
Yeah, they had this 1-hit game against Boston back in June, but the fact that they have so many options to discuss for worst performance is not what you want to see. But again, to dwell on the more positive briefly before we get to some mailbag questions, explosions really all around, eruptions, whichever one word you want to use on Tuesday. Big game for Michael Harris, 2 home runs. Sean Murphy hits a home run. Garcia hits a home run, a bunch of doubles from Soler and Olson and Laureano, etc. And obviously Lopez leaving the game leaves a stink that they would probably trade in a second. If they had been able to save 10 runs for tomorrow, they would have done it. But it also gave them the luxury. And it's kind of, you could argue it's a small thing, but it's not that small of a thing, that when you lose your starting pitcher in the first inning and you can navigate that game without burning your bullpen, it is a great sign. And they got 8 combined innings from their 3, I don't want to say worst, but worst objectively pitchers on the roster, and did so. But to their credit, they pitched great. That's also helpful. But being up 12-0 makes it to where you don't have to worry about at all getting someone like Iglesias or Jimenez up at the bullpen.
Oh, tonight's win was huge for many reasons. I mean, the offense was one thing, but you're absolutely right. The fact that you could cover 8 innings with Jesse Chavez, John Brebbia, and Luke Jackson and never have to sweat is like no small thing.
Yep.
Because there's a world where the Braves score 2 runs again tonight, and Brian Snitker has to go to his big 4 to cover the last few innings. So blowout wins, and to a lesser degree blowout losses, but especially blowout wins, are very, very important over the course of 162 games. It gives everybody a breather. It was a very rare one of these for the Braves. I mean, you could definitively count on one hand the number of these kinds of victories the Braves have had in the second half of the season, where everybody just kind of packs it in and just walks to a victory. So the fact that the offense showed up was great. The fact that the bullpen picked up an injured teammate was huge. In many ways, it was just a very easy breezy win. And for the offense to score 10 runs in the first 4 innings it was almost like, am I dreaming? Is this real? Because it has been a sight for sore eyes to see the team put up crooked numbers, not just in one inning, but multiple innings at a time.
Okay, Scott, Let's go to the mailbag, unless you have some extended thoughts on Tuesday and Monday's games. I don't think you do. I think we're probably out of. We could go deeper, but we don't have to on today's podcast. Do you want to talk about the underachieving lineup question we got? Because it's one that we could probably spend an hour on. We'll try not to do that. But I got a pretty interesting question. It actually came to me, so apologies to everyone for answering my own question. But it came from Ian, a listener to the podcast, who said, can you elaborate on what you said, meaning me, about all of the lineup underachieving other than Ozuna this season? It feels like a 1 in a million chance for that to happen season to season. And for some context before I give it to Scott, what I tweeted was, and I mean this, and I've said it on the show, I think, at some point in recent days, but that Marcell Ozuna is quite literally the only regular opening day player, like projected member of the core team this year on offense, who has met what I would say reasonable projections for that player were coming into the season. I did give the caveat on Twitter, but I'll do it again now, that I did not include Travis d'Arnaud because he's technically the backup catcher, although he definitely would qualify here. If you want to include him, then that's fine. Shouts to Travis. Very, very good player. Best backup catcher in the league, probably. But I wasn't including him. But number one, before we dive into this, Scott, do you think I'm right about this, or you want to disagree with anybody?
No, I mean, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I think baseball just kind of naturally is a sport that has a lot of variance year over year. And it's a pretty fine margin for what constitutes a okay season versus a good season versus a great season. I mean, sometimes it can come down to, literally fractions of a millimeter of hitting a baseball one direction or the other. And instead of a warning track flyout, it's a 3-run homer. And it's the same thing for relievers, right? You have 2 bad appearances over the course of an entire season. It can completely skew your numbers and so on and so forth. But yes, in terms of basically everyone in this lineup other than Marcell Ozuna struggling significantly from their career norms, it does feel like kind of a 1 in a million situation.
Yeah, it's wild. And I pulled these numbers before the game tonight, so they would have changed a little bit, probably in the positive direction, which is good. But Ozuna's actually been better this year than last year. He was really good last year, too. So that's been awesome. Hats up to him. Really good year. I would say Riley's been the closest to being his normal self, but even that, it was a slow start, and he got picked it up, and he got hurt. And by the way, a lot of these guys have been injured, too. We spent a lot of time, I know both of us, and also Steven and Sean, I've just said this, but just for any new listeners, they've also had injuries. It's injury and, not injury or, but injury and underperformance. So I'm not ignoring one when I highlight the other, but it's both. For instance, like Ronald Acuna has been out for a long time. He also was not Ronald Acuna before he went down. He was a good player, but not a MVP candidate. Matt Olson has been good lately, but still for the season well below what you would have projected. Sean Murphy, well below. Ozzy Albies, hurt and well below. Same with Murphy, by the way. Michael Harris, hurt and well below expectations. I won't give all the numbers because it's a podcast. But Arcia, all these guys are 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 points of a WRC plus lower than they were last year. And yes, you could turn around and say last year was an outlier. But honestly, this year is a bigger outlier than last year, in my opinion. Does that sound crazy to you? Because I don't think that it is. I think this year, and granted, last year's offense was arguably by the numbers only the best offense in the history of Major League Baseball, which is crazy to say out loud, but the numbers did support that, or at least on the very short list. And yet this year is pretty clearly the outlier for most of these guys, not compared to last year, but compared to their career baselines. Even guys who, like, I have argued that, yeah, Acuna and Olson, and we said this winter on our old podcast, Scott, a lot of guys we would have projected to be a little bit worse than last year. Acuna, Olson among them. That's fair. Regression was probably going to be coming for those guys, but not this. This is an outlier. It just is.
Yeah, it is. And yes, last year was like a 99th percentile outcome for the offense as a whole. It was historic. Everybody had anywhere from a good to a career best season. And you can't expect that from your, we'll call it the Big Ten hitters for the Braves. There are 8 position players. You have d'Arnaud and then Ozuna. You cannot expect your 10 top hitters to all have career years every single year. And maybe that happened last season. But I think the point is that if I asked you coming into the season, for these 10 players, how many of them are going to exceed expectations? How many are going to meet expectations? And how many of them are going to fail to meet expectations? I think logic and reasoning would be like a third, a third, and a third. Right? Like 3 guys exceed expectations, have great years. 3 of them are ho-hum and they do what they usually do. And then 3 of them fall short for whatever reason. Maybe it's injury,
Yep.
maybe it's bad luck, maybe it's their swing gets out of whack mechanically. Who knows? But the fact that last year, basically all 10 of those hitters had career best seasons, including the MVP, who has missed 80% of the year, and a 4th place finisher in MVP is Matt Olson, is having maybe his worst offensive year of his career. You add those, you add in the injuries, you add in, Sean Murphy looks lost at the plate. I know he had the home run tonight, but Sean Murphy was a really good hitter in his final couple years with the Oakland A's, and even at times last year, and he looks bad. Ozzie Albies is having a down year. You go down the list. I don't think anyone could have realistically expected the Braves to repeat what they did a year ago. But the idea that basically everyone other than Marcell Ozuna and maybe Travis d'Arnaud have significantly failed to meet expectations is something I would have never projected, and even the most pessimistic Braves fan probably wouldn't have expected.
Yeah, no one could project this. And the one thing that I would push back a little bit to what you said is I really think that last year, this is old news, of course, but I really think last year, the biggest thing about last season wasn't that everyone had career years. Like there were guys in the lineup that had good seasons that were not their absolute best. For instance, like Michael Harris, Orlando Arcia actually had better years the previous year, for instance. The real thing about last year's team, sneakily, beyond the top level of Acuna and Olsen being MVP candidates, was that there was no one that had a bad year. And that's what you can't project. To your point, last year, that was the outlier for me. This year, the outlier is everybody going the other way. You would expect some balance there. But even compared to, like, just to be putting this out there, we're not really comparing this year to last year exclusively. Like, it's good to use that as a data point. But, like, I pulled these ZiPS projections, which are really the ones that I like the most from Dan Zaborski at Fangraphs. Preseason projections, they bake in everything. Not just last year. They break in history, age, all these things. And again, every single one of these guys, every single one is significantly below their projection. Not just last year, their objective, non-biased projection. They're below it. Every single one of them, other than Ozuna and d'Arnaud. And that just, what are you supposed to do? I'm shrugging as we're talking. People can't see me, Scott. I'm shrugging.
Yeah, man. If anyone knows, like if anyone definitively knows in a scientific lab, can figure out what on earth is plaguing basically every hitter in this lineup, please tell us. Because it has been it has been so, on a nightly basis, it has been so frustrating to watch, not only because of the production, but because a year ago and even prior to that, where there were a lot of same players in the lineup in 2022, 2021, we know how good this team has been offensively over the years. And to be in this situation now where if you cherry pick your dates, like this has legitimately been a bottom 3 offense in a lot of categories since parts of May and June. And again, even the most pessimistic Braves fan on the planet, I don't think would have told you this was going to be coming back in March and April as the season began.
Definitely not. And if I was writing this instead of talking about it, I would throw a lot more just data out there. It's hard to do in podcast form, but I will shout out Ivan, who works over at Battery Power, has been tracking this all year long about how the Braves have been both bad and frustrating and also unlucky. And people sometimes have a hard time separating those two things. They think if you say that a team is unlucky, that means that you're excusing it, which I'm not doing. You can be both bad and unlucky. You can have bad approach and also be unlucky. It's possible to do both, and the Braves have done that this year. So that's just magnified it. It's made it worse. They'd still be underperforming based on just approach stuff and like the raw data, the expected stats, all the nerdy stuff at StatCast. They're still below where they probably should be. but it's been magnified by the lack of good fortune, which I know. Trust me, I know that nobody wants to hear that. I promise you, I understand that. It's just kind of my job to kind of stay level headed and be like, by the way, unlucky too, on top of everything else.
Right. I mean, I know some folks have questions about StatCast and
Yeah, and it's fine.
yeah, totally. I get it. Not everyone has to love every new, sabermetrics used to be like the buzzword in Major League Baseball about a decade ago. I'm sure we have listeners who eat up every single stat that Fangraphs and Baseball Savant provide. And I'm sure we have listeners who are old school and like batting average and the more traditional stats. And that's fine, man. That's I think one of the coolest things about baseball is there are so many ways to enjoy the game and to evaluate players. And when you talk about this Braves team, and this is kind of a great segue into our next mailbag question.
Yep.
I wonder behind closed doors and behind the scenes, if there is something organizationally that is causing these players to have issues across the board, because just even with the randomness of baseball and the year over year variance, it's hard for me to believe that all of these very established professional hitters are all having really bad seasons all at the same time. And frankly, all of their issues are pretty similar across the board.
Yeah. So this is where it gets interesting because we got a question that you segue beautifully into from Lewis, who just says this. Is Seitzer getting fired? I don't know how much more of this I can watch. If you don't know who that is, it's Kevin Seitzer as the hitting coach for the Braves. He's been around for a very long time. I will admit, longer than I remembered. I looked it up. He was hired in October of 2014. So we're coming up on 10 years of Kevin Seitzer being the batting coach for the Braves. He replaced Greg Walker. If you were my age or older, you might remember that era. But just for reference, he's been around longer than Brian Snitker as far as Snitker as the manager. He was hired under Freddie Gonzalez and was under Freddie for about a year and a half before Snit was promoted to the interim manager title. So, look, what I'm not, and I know you're not either. We're not people that jump to fire so and so when things go wrong. We've had our qualms with Snitker over the years, etc. But we're not like the solution is to fire the hitting coach guys. But this is one of those seasons, whether he deserves it or not, quote unquote, I'm using the giant quotes there, where when this happens, when your team is built to be fantastic offensively, and look, he should get credit for this too. Last year he gets credit because whether it was his fault or not, or his credit or not, they were uber elite last year and he has to get credit for that. But the same thing happens this year where, yeah, there were injuries, but when this lineup performs this way for this long, people are going to look at the hitting coach.
Yeah.
And I wonder what that even says. Like, it just hasn't worked at all. And the approach stuff, I'm not an look, we watch a lot of baseball. We analyze baseball. I'm not a hitting coach. I can see some things, but I won't purport to be someone who can fix somebody's swing. But I will say there have been many, many, many nights, many moments, many plate appearances where it's like, guys, is there a plan here? And that's the kind of stuff that will push it. Of course, I would say push the focus more toward the approach side, and that when the approach side is more in play, you're talking about the hitting coach.
Yeah, I mean, you took the words out of my mouth. There are some nights where I have sat on my couch and watched the game and like said aloud to my dog or my wife or whoever will listen to me, what are they doing? And I think that was something the last couple of years that the Braves seemingly had this great plan in the batter's box every single night. Some nights they were really aggressive. Some nights it looked like they were genuinely going out there against a good pitcher, just trying to foul off a bunch of pitches to get him out of the game after 5 innings. And it worked because the Braves won 100 plus games in both of the last 2 years. So the fact that they have gone from this offensive juggernaut to this borderline unwatchable team offensively it stumps me. I really don't know, Brad. I mean, I think to answer Lewis's question, is Kevin Seitzer getting fired? I don't know, to be honest. I would say
we can't possibly know, just to give that caveat. Like, we're not, even if we're not on the beat. I doubt the beat guys know either, but we're not in the clubhouse every day. We don't know. We're just going to give our semi-educated guess.
Sure.
Just say that out loud.
To me, I think in sports, there are moments where like everybody in the world knows a coach is getting fired. Like,
Yes.
it's week 18, the NFL team has quit and the team is 2-14. Like everybody knows that coach is getting fired. I don't, man, to not cop out, I would say it is 51% likely that Seitzer is back next season, but I don't say that with any conviction. And frankly, the next 3 weeks, and I mean, let's say this, Brad. What if the Braves make the postseason and they win a couple of rounds and the offense performs pretty well? Exactly. Then but at the same time, to be on the other end of that argument, let's say the Braves continue to not score any runs in the last 3 weeks of the season, and against the Mets, which is probably going to determine the playoffs. The Braves play New York 3 games at Truist Park, the second to last series of the year. If the Braves go out and score 2 runs in those 3 baseball games, it feels to me like the next 3 weeks will probably decide whether or not Seitzer is brought back for 2025.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And this is a very, very loyal situation where like Brian Snitker is not going to be someone that's going to be actively trying to fire one of his key lieutenants. Like that's the rep that Snit has, and it's one he's earned. That steady hand has done a lot for the organization. So that's part of this too. And again, it's really hard to do this in a vacuum because it would have been insane, Scott, if we put the odds on Kevin Seitzer being fired at the end of the season in March. What would the odds have been? It would have been infinitesimal.
Yeah, 5%, 2%.
Right.
I mean, nothing.
So the combination of it would have had to go this bad for it to even be a question. And even then, we still don't know. So I do tend to agree with you, and it sounds like a cop-out, I'm sure, about whether it'll happen. Wake me up and ask me in a month is the real answer, because I think that the Braves could erase some of this stuff, and it's a results-based business. If they hit at the right times, if they get hot, if they keep winning, and make a run of some kind, then you can credibly look at your roster and your coaching staff and be like, all right, no changes. And again, I believe he's their longest tenured coach. I mean, besides Snit, of course. Snit's been on the roster and on the organization forever. But yeah, weird situation, and one that's like hard to answer. And we talked around it. I know you brought it up and got yelled at before, and I don't think you're crazy at all for bringing it up. There's this whole subplot right now as well. I don't know if you want to dive into this or not. Chipper Jones gave an interview this week, expressed some frustration with the organization, it seemed like, or the players, or maybe it's just about modern baseball through the lens of the Braves. With Corey Kluber, he talked to him about that. Chipper always comes up in these conversations because he, for all of Chipper's chipperness, is a hitting savant, always was, and he has gotten some credit for fixing guys or tweaking some stuff, and he hasn't been around the team. I, for one, and I'll let you respond, I for one, think that's overblown. I don't think that the reason the Braves are not hitting this year is because Chipper hasn't been around. That seems insane to me. But it's also fair to be like, hey, maybe it's a factor. Like he is a genius of a hitter. So what do you think about that whole situation? It's a subplot, but it's something worth talking about.
Yeah, and if folks missed this, Chipper was on Corey Kluber's podcast, and I believe it's on YouTube as well, just talking about offense in general. And the first couple minutes, it sounded very John Smoltz-like, where Chipper was just like completely crapping on everything about modern baseball.
Oh yeah, there was a lot of that in there.
Yeah, there was. And I get it, man. Like these guys, John Smoltz, Chipper Jones, played in a different era. They are phenomenal baseball players, and I think they're really sharp baseball minds, even if they don't necessarily agree with what the Braves preach. And Chipper talked about that. And the fact that organizationally, Alex Anthopoulos and team really praise slugging and getting on base. And Chipper had some interesting comments about situational hitting and bunting, and it is worth a listen to be sure. I think my takeaway is I absolutely love every time Chipper Jones is around the Braves. I would trust him with any hitter on this team. Truly. Like if anyone's in a slump, go talk to Chipper. Hell, bring in Chipper Jones's dad, who's apparently like a hitting coach genius as well. I think
True.
Freddie Freeman talked about Chipper's dad helping him out one time. But at the same time, man, I mean, I love Chipper. I wish he was around, but the idea that Chipper not being around the team is the reason they have gone from a historic offense to this very painful to watch offense. I mean, I just don't think that is the common denominator here.
Yeah, and this is almost like our third and probably final mailbag question for the day. Is like we got a lot of questions about Chipper and this offshoot of the podcast and all that stuff. And I do think it's interesting. He's obviously a Hall of Famer and a huge name, and I would be interested to get True Serum on the Brave side of what they think about Chipper saying what he said on this podcast and what that relationship's like right now. But yeah, it's just interesting, especially in the midst of this conversation about Seitzer and the conversation about their offense not being very good for a long period of time now, and all that stuff is rolled into one. But we didn't fix everything on this podcast, Scott, but we did manage to answer some questions and talk about the offense in a more comprehensive fashion. Like I said before, we were going to do a lot of mailbag, and then Lopez got hurt, and we kind of had to pivot. But hopefully that was good enough for today to satisfy that. We do like mailbag questions, so if you want to ever send any in, you can do so, especially via Twitter/X. We're at Hammer Territory as a podcast. We're also individually on there. I'm at BT Rowland. Scott is at Scott Coleman 55. Also, Sean and Steven are active on Twitter/X as well. And we also have an email address if anybody ever wants to use it. It's hammerterritory@gmail.com. Scott, before we sign off, do you want to have any thoughts on I almost want to call it a finale. I guess it's a finale because it's the last game against the Nats all season long on Wednesday night.
Yeah, for a club the Braves have really struggled against this season, let's hope that the Braves can go out there and sweep this mini 2-game series in Washington. Max Fried is going to be out there. Max has been really, really good lately, and he'll be opposed by Jake Irvin, who has been awesome against the Braves in recent starts, although Irvin has been pretty bad otherwise, and maybe that's not a giant shock. But you win this big game on Tuesday night. Let's hope they get good news on Reynaldo's shoulder. If you can win on Wednesday, then you're off on Thursday and come right back home for a very important 4-game series with the Dodgers. So let us all hope the Braves can take care of business on Wednesday night, keep the momentum rolling, especially on a night when the Mets lost and are playing a Blue Jays team that's still fighting, as we saw over the weekend. Let's hope the Braves can keep the momentum and then get ready for a talented, even if injured quite a bit, Dodgers team for, 4 games at home against LA is about as important of a series as the Braves are going to play this month.
You're right about that for sure. And to back you up, Jake Irvin, 3 starts against the Braves this year, 17 in the third innings, 1.04 ERA. So he has been ace-like against Atlanta and pretty middling against everybody else, but we will see what happens when Wednesday. I will still say, objectively speaking, Fried versus Irvin is an advantage to the Braves. So we'll circle that. Maybe I'll sound crazy a day from now, but I will stand on that for now. All right, we'll have more coming up later on this week on the podcast. I believe our friends Steven and Sean have plenty to add to the discussion in between appearances from us. You and I are scheduled to be back at some point over the weekend to discuss part of the Dodger series. But one more time, Scott, anything to share before we sign off today?
Nothing to share. I hope everybody out there is doing well, and we always do. We sincerely mean it when we say we appreciate all the support for the show. So take care, everybody, and we'll have plenty of shows coming on the feed this week.
That's right. Please subscribe. One more time, one more plea from us to smash that subscribe button on Apple, on Spotify, multiple times if you want to. Overcast, Amazon Music, I believe we're on there. We're now on YouTube if you want to find us there. Ratings and reviews, very much appreciated. Follow us across social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, etc. at Hammer Territory. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast today. Stay tuned for more this week, and we'll see you all next time.